Breaking every rule of wilderness survival, a solitary man in Alaska did the unthinkable. He let a freezing mother bear and her cubs onto his porch. No one could have predicted the shocking consequences that would follow. The thermometer outside. Jack Frost's cabin read 40 degrees below zero, and the temperature was still dropping. In the 5 years he had spent in this remote stretch of Alaska, he had never seen the cold bite so viciously. The approaching storm wasn't just another brutal winter challenge. It was a force so relentless that even the toughest wilderness survivors would think twice. Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, 4 hours from the nearest town, stood a small wooden cabin, the home of a former wildlife photographer who had traded city life for solitude. On that frigid morning, listening to the wind howl through the trees, Jack felt, for the first time, a flicker of doubt about his decision to live here. The day began like any other. Jack woke to the last embers of his fireplace, casting a faint glow across the room. Through frost-covered windows, he saw a fresh layer of snow had settled overnight, thickening the already deep drifts. At 45, Jack had developed a strict routine that kept him alive in these unforgiving conditions. Every morning, he checked the weather radio, took stock of his supplies, and ensured his equipment was in working order. His cabin walls were lined with photographs he had taken. Wolves, moose, and bears frozen in time, silent reminders of the life he had once lived. His work had graced the pages of top wildlife magazines, but after his wife's passing 3 years ago, he had abandoned everything, seeking solace in isolation. That morning's forecast unsettled him. A storm was approaching from the north, with winds strong enough to snap trees and temperatures cold enough to shatter records. He would be trapped inside for days, maybe longer. Jack spent the day securing the generator, double-checking his backup heat source, and reinforcing every precaution drilled into him over the years. His father's old saying echoed in his mind, "Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, son." Those words had saved his life more than once. By evening, the storm arrived with merciless force. Snow fell so heavily it blurred the world into a white void. Jack threw more logs into the fire and ran through his emergency checklist. His satellite phone, his only link to civilization, lay fully charged beside his radio. If anything went wrong, there would be no help, not in this weather. As night fell, the storm grew even stronger. The wind forced its way through the cracks in the cabin walls, creating a low, ghostly whistle that Jack had never quite learned to ignore. Then, just after midnight, a sound cut through the howling wind, a deep guttural noise that sent a jolt through Jack's spine. It was faint, but unmistakable. A bear in February. Bears should be deep in hibernation. If one was awake in this deadly cold, something was terribly wrong. Grabbing his flashlight, Jack moved cautiously to the window. His beam barely pierced the swirling snow, but then, through the white haze, he saw them. 3 dark shapes struggling against the storm, a mother bear and her 2 cubs. Even from inside, Jack could see they were fighting for their lives. The mother's once powerful stride had weakened into an exhausted shuffle, and her cubs pressed desperately against her side. He had spent years studying wildlife behavior, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. This mother bear was desperate. Something must have forced them from their den, driving them into the storm. Seeking any form of shelter, they pressed toward the cabin, their fur crusted with ice. The cubs shivered violently, their small bodies not built for this level of cold. Jack's pulse pounded as the mother bear reached the porch. Every survival manual warned against this exact situation. Oh wow, desperate bear was unpredictable, dangerous. Yet these cubs were much smaller than they should have been, likely born late in the season. Their chances of surviving the night were almost none. The mother began clawing at the snow, attempting to dig a shelter near the porch, but the wind erased her work instantly. The temperature had plummeted further, so cold that even the liquid inside Jack's thermometer had frozen solid. Then one of the cubs stumbled. Jack watched as the tiny creature sank into the snow, its fragile body struggling to rise. The mother gently lifted it, but its movements were slowing. The second cub collapsed moments later, taking longer to get back up. The mother bear's strength was fading. She let out a low, mournful sound, a sound of pure desperation that cut through Jack like a knife. The bears now huddled against his porch, a last, hopeless attempt to escape the deadly wind. Jack could see it now, the mother's glassy eyes, the cubs shivering less and less, a dangerous sign. Hypothermia was setting in. His hand rested on the door handle. Everything he knew about survival screamed at him not to do it. And yet, his grip tightened, and he made his choice. Everything Jack knew about wilderness survival, every rule he had lived by for years, told him to stay inside. But the bears on his porch were freezing to death. And at that moment, survival rules felt meaningless compared to the sight before him. Living creatures struggling, needing help. The cubs had almost stopped moving. The mother bear, her massive frame trembling, desperately tried to shield them from the wind, her body their last defense, against the cold. Then her eyes met Jack's through the frost-covered glass, and what he saw shook him to his core. There was no aggression, only exhaustion, desperation, and something eerily close to surrender. Jack's cabin had an attached storage room, separate from his living space, well insulated, and stocked with his old photography equipment. It could serve as a temporary shelter. But the thought of bringing 3 wild bears inside was madness. A panicked bear could tear through the cabin in seconds, leaving him stranded in the storm with no protection. But the cubs weren't moving. Their tiny bodies were half buried in the snow, their chests rising and falling so faintly, it was almost impossible to tell if they were still breathing. The mother bear's strength was fading fast, her eyes drifting shut, her body slowly sinking. Into the snow. A few more minutes and it would be too late. Jack didn't have time to debate the risks. He turned on all the heaters in the storage room, pushing the temperature as high as possible. He laid blankets near the entrance, his hands moving fast. Through the window, the mother bear's gaze followed his every move, as if trying to understand what he was doing. In that moment, Jack no longer saw a dangerous predator. He saw a mother who had fought with everything she had left. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling with unrelenting fury. The clock showed 2 a.m., the coldest, darkest hour of the night. Jack took a deep breath and turned the door handle. The door creaked open, the sound sharp against the frozen silence. The wind rushed in like a living force, biting into Jack's skin, sending flurries of snow swirling through the cabin. The bears were only a few steps away, their bodies half buried in the drifts. Moving slowly with deliberate caution, Jack stepped onto the porch. The mother bear's eyes gleamed as she registered his presence. She didn't move. Jack could see the battle between her instincts and exhaustion. Her nostrils flared, catching his scent. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. He knew the words meant nothing to her, but maybe the tone did. Carefully, he began clearing a path from the porch to the storage room, making every movement slow and unthreatening. The mother bear didn't lunge, didn't growl. She simply watched. The cubs still weren't moving. Time was slipping away. Jack had to act now, or not at all. With numb, trembling fingers, he threw the storage room door open. Warm air spilled into the frozen night, creating a thick mist as it clashed with the bitter cold. The mother bear's head lifted slightly. Her nostrils flared again. It was the most movement she had shown in nearly an hour. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears as he stepped closer, holding blankets in his hands. The mother bear watched him, her instincts dulled by exhaustion. Just a few steps away now. Slowly, carefully, Jack draped a blanket over the cubs' fragile bodies. For a moment, the mother bear tensed, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. If she attacked now, he wouldn't have time to react. But instead, she sniffed the blanket wrapped around her cubs as if trying to understand. Jack took another blanket and spread it closer to the storage room door, creating a warm path. His fingers were completely numb now. He couldn't stay outside much longer. Everything depended on what happened next. The mother bear struggled to stand, her legs shaking beneath her. The cubs lay motionless under the blanket, their small forms barely rising with each shallow breath. With a trembling nudge, she tried to rouse them, but they did not respond. A low, mournful sound escaped her throat, a mother's plea in the face of the relentless storm. Jack took a slow step back toward the storage room door, letting the heat spill into the frozen night. It was a beacon of life against the suffocating cold. The mother bear hesitated, her body swaying as exhaustion threatened to pull her down. Then, with quiet determination, she gripped the blanket between her teeth and began dragging her cubs forward. Each step drained what little strength she had left, her powerful muscles quivering with effort. The snow resisted, the weight of her own body a burden, but she pushed on. Jack stood frozen, barely daring to breathe, watching the impossible unfold. This wild creature, driven by nothing but love, inching her way toward salvation. At last they reached the threshold. The mother bear paused, her massive frame filling the doorway, steam rising from her fur as warmth wrapped around her like a forgotten memory. This was the moment of greatest risk. If she panicked now, there would be no way out. But the cold had taken its toll, dulling her fear, leaving only instinct, the need to save her cubs. With a final surge of strength, she pulled them inside, collapsing beside them, her body curling protectively around their tiny forms. Jack exhaled, barely realizing he'd been holding his breath. Moving with painstaking care, he closed the door, sealing the bears within the safety of the room. Through the small window, he watched as the mother bear's tense body slowly relaxed, though her eyes remained on him, still wary, still wild. For hours, Jack stayed by the window, listening to the storm batter the walls of the cabin. But inside, a quiet miracle was unfolding. The cubs stirred first. Small, weak movements at first, barely noticeable, but then more. Their tiny paws shifted, their bodies twitching as life fought its way back in. The mother bear sniffed them, her deep breaths coaxing them awake. By sunrise, their little heads lifted, their bright eyes blinking in the dim light. They stayed close to their mother, but as their strength returned, so did their playfulness. Outside, the blizzard raged for 2 more days. Jack placed food and water just outside the storage room door, waiting for the mother bear to decide if she would accept his help. And she did. Slowly, her wariness eased into something softer, not trust, but a quiet understanding. On the 3rd morning, the world had changed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of dazzling white. The sun, hidden for days, finally broke through, casting a golden glow over the snow. It was time. Jack moved carefully, just as he had that first night, and opened the outer door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of the forest, of freedom. The mother bear lifted her head, her dark eyes flickering toward the light. She shifted her weight, then rose, not the weak, desperate creature she had been, but strong once more. At the threshold, she hesitated. Jack stood a few feet away, letting her make the choice. When she turned her head, their eyes met, and in that moment something passed between them. Then, with effortless grace, she stepped forward. Her cubs followed, bounding through the snow. Jack watched as they moved toward the tree line, their capo, dark shapes growing smaller against the endless white. At the edge of the forest, the mother bear stopped. She looked back one last time. Then she disappeared into the wilderness, leaving only her tracks behind. 6 months passed. The memory of that night had never faded, but as summer settled over the mountains, it had become something Jack carried. Deep inside, a moment that belonged only to him. On a warm August afternoon, he drove his old pickup along the winding mountain road, the bed filled with supplies from his rare trip to town. After the brutal winter, the forest had come alive again, and his camera had been busy capturing it all. Then, as he rounded a bend, something massive stepped onto the road. Jack slammed the brakes. The tires skidded, the truck jolting to a stop, inches from a tree. His pulse hammered in his ears as he stared at the bear standing before him. She was enormous, her dark fur shining in the summer sun. But it wasn't just her size that sent a chill through him. It was the way she stood, unmoving, watching him. No, it couldn't be. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel. He whispered, "What the hell?" The bear didn't move. The engine rumbled. and he considered revving it, hoping the sound would scare her away. But before he could, the ground beneath him began to tremble. A deep rumble filled the air, growing louder by the second. The bear turned her head, looking toward the cliffs ahead. Then, she looked back at Jack, her eyes filled with something urgent. Split second later, the world cracked open. Just beyond where she stood, the rock face gave way. Massive boulders tore free, crashing onto the road with deafening force. Another, then another. Within seconds, the path ahead was buried under tons of jagged stone and dirt. Jack sat frozen, realization slamming into him. If he had kept driving, if she hadn't stopped him, he would have been right in the middle of it. She had saved him. The last echoes of the rock slide faded, leaving only stunned silence. Slowly, the bear turned. From the trees, two smaller figures emerged. Strong, healthy cubs, their coats sleek in the sunlight. Jack watched, still gripping the wheel, as the mother bear gave him one final look. Then she nudged her cubs forward, leading them back into the forest. Jack exhaled, running a hand over his face. His gaze drifted to the impassable pile of rubble ahead, then back to the empty road where the bear had stood. Life in the wild had taught him many things, but this was something different. Sometimes gratitude in nature comes from where you least expect it. Jack turned his truck around and took the long way home. Some things weren't meant for the lens of a camera. Some things were meant for the soul.